Hey guys, Blarg here for Rise of Zek. Welcome to part 4 of our ongoing coverage of a legal battle between Daybreak Games and the Hero's Journey Everquest emulator. Over the last few videos, we covered the run-up to the hearing on Daybreak's motion for a preliminary injunction. Well, it took a while, but the judge has finally ruled. Yesterday, the order came down hard in Daybreak's favor. We won't bury the lead. THJ is toast. But in this video, we'll go through the court's reasoning point by point, looking at what this means for the defendants, for Everquest, and for the entire emulator scene. So, yesterday, the federal court for the Southern District of California issued a 30-page order granting Daybreak's motion for injunction. The ruling stops the hero's journey in its tracks. It prohibits the defendants, Christopher Takahashi and Alexander Taylor, the owners of THJ, from, quote, developing, distributing, licensing, promoting, or otherwise making available THJ or any similar software. Also, operating the THJ website and any other websites used to promote or distribute THJ, maintaining any public or private repositories containing the code for THJ, and operating any server emulation software that enables unauthorized access to Everquest. In short, THJ is offline, not just paused, but legally barred from continuing. As we previously mentioned, shutting the server down is massive because the defendants were probably relying on the income from the server to help fund their legal battle. Estimates in the actual lawsuit were that THJ was bringing in approximately $100,000 a month, way higher than the $30,000 number that was thrown around in the whistleblower email. Now, without those funds, we wonder if THJ is even going to be able to afford this fight. The judge did require Daybreak to post a $1 million bond under Rule 65C. That basically acts as a safety net if it turns out the injunction was wrongly issued so that THJ can be compensated for the time the server was offline. But we think such a finding is very unlikely, as you'll see from some of the court's strongly worded opinions a little later on in the video. Now, the central issue in this injunction hearing, and really the whole case overall, comes down to whether THJ infringed Daybreak's copyrights. The standard to be met on whether or not the injunction should be granted is whether Daybreak would be likely to win on the merits if the case went all the way to trial. And the judge found here that it would, decisively. Daybreak presented evidence that THJ copied not just the game code, but also characters, environments, textures, UI elements, even the feel of the world itself. The court quoted expert testimony that THJ involved systematically altering 234 of Daybreak's copyrighted files, inserting 4,215 files, deleting 66 files, and using Daybreak's audio-visual asset library, including character models, environmental textures, spell effects, and user interface elements. Now, the defendants pushed back, claiming THJ was built on reverse-engineered open-source code and that the copying was minimal, but the court wasn't convinced. One of the sharpest lines in the order was this, quote, quantitatively insignificant infringement may be substantial if the material is qualitatively important to the plaintiff's work. The ruling also took aim at the hero's journey under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA. Now, Everquest has technical protections in place, like server authentication and subscription checks that control access to the game. And Daybreak claims THJ bypassed those protections by redirecting login files to its own unauthorized servers. The judge wrote, almost directly quoting Daybreak's argument, that, quote, defendants likely engaged in circumvention by altering files to redirect users to THJ servers and bypass Daybreak's official servers that implement TPMs. Now, the defense argued that they weren't really circumventing anything since THJ never touched Daybreak servers, but the court flatly rejected that, saying that even though defendants do not directly access Daybreak servers, the operation of THJ effectively circumvents Everquest TPMs, enabling them and third parties to access Everquest's copyrighted works. Now, if you watched our previous videos, you'll remember that THJ put forth several defenses that we thought might have some merit depending on what the evidence showed at the hearing. But the court shot each and every one of those down in turn. On estoppel, THJ argued Daybreak had implicitly allowed emulators for decades, but the judge ruled that, quote, nothing in the record suggests that Daybreak intended or acted in a manner that would allow defendants to believe they could profit from Daybreak's copyrighted works without a written agreement or license. For laches, THJ said Daybreak waited too long to sue us. But the court disagreed, pointing out that Daybreak had regularly sent cease and desist letters to emulator projects over the years. And while those aren't lawsuits, they were clear evidence of Daybreak protecting their rights and likely would have led to lawsuits had the offenders not stopped the conduct. And finally, on fair use, the defendants' last big argument was that their modifications were transformative and therefore fair use. But the court hit back hard here, saying the court finds that this is not the case, particularly in light of the defendants' extensive copying, which they used to operate a competing game with minimal new expressions, meaning, or message. All four factors of the fair use test, purpose, nature of the work, amount taken, and effect on the market weighed heavily against THJ in the eyes of the court. Now, one of the most damaging parts of the entire order was the finding of irreparable harm. Daybreak showed that THJ had exploded from 2,000 users in December of 2024 to over 30,000 users less than a year later. At the same time, Everquest's own servers were losing players. And the court cited to comments that were presented by Daybreak in their motions and briefings made by various users of THJ, saying things like, quote, the day I started THJ, I stopped my Everquest subs, and I'm never going back to the original Everquest again, amongst other things. And here the judge concluded the erosion of market share that threatens to undermine Daybreak's business model, along with the enabling of ongoing third-party infringement, are harms that cannot be quantified or repaired by monetary damages. This means that simply waiting and allowing THJ to pay Daybreak some amount of money once the trial was done and an award was granted is simply not enough to protect Daybreak from all the harm that's happening, and therefore the injunction was necessary. Now, THJ's lawyers argued that shutting THJ down would destroy a passionate community and that would be against public interest. But the court responded that the community's value can't outweigh the law. Essentially, the court says the public interest in protecting copyright rights is greater than the value the community might place on the server. And here, the law is pretty clear. The court quoted some well-established California law that a defendant who builds a business model based upon a clear violation of the property rights of a plaintiff can't defeat a preliminary injunction by claiming their business will be harmed if they're required to respect the other person's property rights. And fans of THJ will hate to hear this, but we've got to agree on this one. So, where does that leave everything? The hero's journey is done. At least for now, but honestly, it's probably done. Unless the defendants appealed, they can't operate, promote, or update the emulator in any way. Now, the injunction doesn't end the case. A trial and potential damages are still somewhere ahead in the future. But it's a very decisive win for Daybreak and a real warning shot across the bow to the general emulator community. I have no doubt that Blizzard and others are watching this one very closely, especially considering Blizzard's recent round of cease and desist letters and lawsuits. By the way, check out our video on those as well if you're interested. We'll put a link to it in the cards. As far as our continuing coverage of THJ, of course we'll keep an eye on this case, and especially if THJ files an appeal, but for all intents and purposes, this case is probably over for a while. Even if THJ stays in the fight despite losing their income stream, we'll have months if not years of discovery ahead of us, and by the time we get to a trial, who knows if the community will even be interested in THJ. And by that time, Daybreak may have their own multi-classing server, who knows. So that probably caps off Rise of Zek's coverage of the hero's journey for a little while. But we've become very interested in MMO litigation lately, so we may dive into the broader implications of legal actions on emulated game servers in general. If that's something you're interested in, make sure to like and subscribe so you know when that gets posted. And if you've been following along with this since part 1, we really appreciate you sticking around. Make sure you share your thoughts in the comments on the whole saga, as well as maybe if you'd like to see that deep dive video, and especially if you've played on the servers. And while you're down there, maybe pour one out for THJ. That's all for now, and we'll see you guys next time.